Well, the sport is increasingly global. I think that's probably the most significant reality that you have to observe in understanding who's coming into modern boxing is that if you look at it from the perspective of an American who wants significant American participation, then you might see boxing as a sport treading water or perhaps a sport in decline. If you were from Eastern Europe and applied the same filter, then you'd say, wow, this is a rapidly growing sport with enormous future potential. You might say the same thing from the perspective of the Pacific Rim or from those societies which are advanced enough to generate some form of economic activity in Africa or the South Pacific. In all of these places, boxing is growing and the number of participants is growing. And that reflects the fact that boxing is difficult. It's not a choice that people make for fun. It always, in most societies, has reflected ethnic divisions in economic struggle or transition. And we see that even among those fighters who are emerging now into the sport from cultures other than the United States. Quite often, an Eastern European fighter is someone who was born in Kazakhstan and grew up in Ukraine and has somehow experienced a displacement or a division from his own heritage or background. And these are often the people who wind up somehow being tracked into boxing gyms when they're 8, 9, or 10 years old. In the United States, you have a society which has graduated to a higher level of economic affluence and leisure activity than any other society in the history of the world, and consequently there are fewer and fewer kids going into boxing. Those kids who go into boxing in the United States, as often as not, reflect the continuing economic struggle of some ethnic minorities or the entry into this country of new ethnic minorities. It isn't necessarily immigrant Jews and immigrant Irish people anymore who enter into boxing, but immigrant Latinos, immigrant Eastern Europeans, immigrants from Balkan societies, African immigrants. I'm seeing a lot of those kinds of people emerging into boxing. So I think it's a sport which continues to attract global attention and is gaining momentum as an attraction in a number of societies around the world, even while you get to read the Boxing is Dead column once a week in the United States. Boxing has an unusual marriage with pay cable television. It's kind of an interesting joining of forces because, of course, boxing reflects poverty and pay cable television is an affluence item. But nevertheless, that's where the audience tends to concentrate for big events. Latino immigrants watch boxing in enormous numbers. I think African Americans are, as an ethnic group, generally interested in boxing, and then there are quite a number of fans who have been a part of the cult for 15, 20, 25 years, going back to their childhoods. Their parents showed them Muhammad Ali or Sugar Ray Robinson or Sugar Ray Leonard or Roberto Duran, and they still have a passion for the sport, although often they complain about its circumstances. I think all sports are cult sports. I mean, to me, Major League Baseball is a cult sport. I don't find a broad-based societal participation in that as was the case 25, 30 years ago. Outside of the NFL, which is the one sort of across-the-board attraction in the United States that seems to touch all groups, all sports are cult sports. And boxing is most definitely a cult sport. And yes, I think the overwhelming majority of American boxing fans are either people with some casual orientation to big fights who would call themselves boxing fans, or they are full-on members of the cult who surf the web for boxing information, read what's written on the websites, and have a day-to-day instinct to follow the sport. I don't think there's any direct correspondence between ethnicity and pay-per-view. The reason for the marriage between boxing and pay-per-view is that boxing is the most entrepreneurial sport. It's the one sport without any organized schedule or competitive hierarchy whatsoever. So the fan has an appreciation that a part of a big fight is its scarcity. If I have to pay $50 to see Oscar De La Hoya fight Felix Trinidad, it doesn't seem like a big price to me because I know that the fight is probably only going to take place one time, and that is unique among sports events. That's the reason for the pay-per-view linkage. Scarcity drives price, and boxing is the only sport which can sell scarcity. In Major League Baseball, I know that the Red Sox are going to play the Yankees on Tuesday. You can't scare me out of thinking that I'm going to see it. In boxing, you never know. So I think that pay-per-view has to do not with ethnicity, but with the scarcity, the perceived scarcity of the event for the consumer. Latino fans are passionate, and they affiliate not only with Latino fighters, Latino American fighters, but with fighters from other cultures as well. One of the hottest fighters in the world as an attraction right now is Manny Pacquiao of the Philippines. Biggest name individual in the Philippines, tremendous star in the Pacific Rim, but enormously popular with Latino fans here in the United States. And not just because he has beaten Latino fighters, but because they know that Spanish is a language that is used in the Filipino culture. They feel a certain kinship with him because of that. And he also fights a blood and guts, all-out, exciting style, which is what Latinos perceive as their style. Even though in the continuing cross-pollination of the sport, we're seeing more and more technical boxers from Mexico now. Didn't used to see them. Marco Antonio Barrera, Juan Manuel Marquez, these are extremely skilled boxers. Used to be every European fighter was a technician. We're starting to see brawlers out of Europe. So the bottom line is styles are migrating around the world, and that's going to affect fan participation as well. The fact that the sport is procedurally corrupt is actually, in a perverse way, a plus. It drives a lot of interest in the sport, just as it turns off some interest in the sport. It's a two-edged sword. All these things fit together. All these things fit together in a cocktail that brews itself into boxing's appeal. It's a lifetime pursuit to learn boxing craft, and it's very important, I think, for a young amateur fighter to have a bond of trust with a trainer who understands the superiority of craft. There are a lot of boxing fans who think this is about rage, this is about strength, this is about power, this is about hand speed, and all those things can certainly figure in. But if you don't have craft, you can't use any of that. And so the really great fighters who emerge from amateur boxing, from the 200, 300 fight amateur career, thrive on the science of the sport and their understanding of something that is really inner, that is shared among a relatively small number of people, that you only get orally in the gym. You're not going to get it off of a videotape. And there's a dwindling number of true sage trainers, the real oral historians, the wise men of the sport, who can hand down what Ray Arcel and Joe Brown and Doc Kearns and various trainers created over the years for their fighters. Just aren't that many left. And so if an American amateur fighter happens to have a bond with a trainer like that, if you're a 17-year-old heavyweight, Hasim Rahman Jr., and your amateur trainer is Emmanuel Stewart, then you have light years advantage over the same heavyweight in Topeka with a trainer who doesn't have that kind of skill, knowledge, and background. I think fighters are tremendously dependent on their corners, by and large. The fighter under the age of 30 who can manage his own way through a fight without needing significant help from his corner is rare. And trust is the central element of the entire enterprise. If the fighter isn't willing to go in with courage and try to execute what his trainer tells him is going to work, then he's probably diminishing his chance in the prize fight. So I've seen many fighters whose careers went only as far as their trainer could take them. This often happens with the terrific amateur fighter, the terrific young pro whose father is his trainer. Perfect example is a fighter named Danny Romero from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Danny Romero was a terrific amateur star and a knockout sensation as a young pro fighter. Pointed most of his career toward a matchup with his fellow Albuquerque fighter, Johnny Tapia. Johnny Tapia happened to have had about 6 or 7 of the top trainers in the sport in succession. Johnny Tapia happened to be technically gifted to begin with. And when Danny Romero and Johnny Tapia finally fought, bringing together 2 guys who had been going toward each other for as much as a dozen years, within a few rounds it was abundantly clear that Johnny Tapia had been to graduate school, and Danny Romero had learned only what his father had taught him. And his father had done a wonderful job to get him to a particular level, but he wasn't in the league with the kind of guys who had spoken to Johnny Tapia, who had gained his trust, who had been in his ear, who had been in the gym with him. And craft completely took apart talent. We see it happen all the time in boxing, and that's the importance of those great trainers who can go beyond a certain level and can keep their fighter developing for years and years and years as they learn. Very positive stories of fathers and sons, but they usually come to a negative end somewhere along the line. Even the guys who have done the most spectacularly successful jobs with their sons, Jack Mosley with Shane Mosley, Felix Trinidad Sr. with Felix Trinidad Jr., eventually both of those fighters came to situations where it was abundantly clear that their fathers were not going to give them the extra push they needed. Their fathers were not going to be able to tell them the hard truth they needed to hear. And they both were humiliated in fights where their fathers, I believe, let them down in the corner, either because they weren't willing to push them hard enough or they weren't prepared to deal with failure as opposed to success. Everything had been a sweet ride up to that time. It's a sad fact of the sport, a very sad fact of the sport, that when you see ring death, usually because of brain trauma, quite frequently a factor in ring death is the father trainer who sends his son out round after round to take a beating. That was Duke Koo Kim against Ray Mancini on national television. That was Jimmy Garcia against Gabe Ruelas before a big crowd in Las Vegas. That was Levander Johnson against Jesus Chavez last year. And there are others I could cite along the way. It's a blockage where the father trainer is not willing to see the truth of what's happening to his son in the ring. So I happen to think the father trainer thing is probably really good in a lot of instances for an amateur fighter, and I happen to think that virtually every fighter ought to, as a professional, switch to some other trainer besides his father for a more objective focus on what he does. I think the sport has always been about craft and technique. It's probably an available premise that there are more fighters in the sport now with high school educations and some college or college education, or obviously the Klitschkos are a whole different story with PhDs and speaking 4 or 5 languages. That reflects their background as products of the Soviet Sports Institute training system. But the bottom line is Gene Tunney was an educated man, college graduate. Jack Johnson was an immensely educated man, although on his own terms, not via a university. I think there have always been these people in the sport, never in giant numbers. Whether there are more now than in the 1920s or 1930s, I'm not really equipped to say. It seems like, as a general perception, that sounds valid, but I don't know for sure. I wasn't around in the 20s or 30s to meet those guys. You'd be amazed at the number of people who will walk in the room, victims obviously of extreme poverty from Africa or South America or Mexico, and tell you that they've had 2 years of college. Or I had a guy a couple weeks ago tell me that he's a lawyer, a trained lawyer, and he came from Los Mochis, a tiny, hard-bitten poverty town in the south of Mexico. So, there are very idiosyncratic paths into the sport, people from all over. Yeah, you're probably right. There are probably more people with educations now, but they've always been there in some form or fashion. It's not a dying sport. It spits out just as many first-class plane tickets and hotel suites for me as it did 15 years ago, probably more. It occupies significantly more hours on HBO than was the case 3 or 4 years ago, and that's from an artistic and economic success standpoint, the number one television network in the business. It grows globally at a very appreciable pace. In fact, I would say to you that boxing is the third biggest sport on the planet. The biggest sport on the planet is soccer. The second biggest sport on the planet is whatever is your local obsession, whether it's National Football League football in the United States or snooker in Australia or whatever. Whatever is the local obsession is number two. And then boxing is number three, because no sport will produce cultural heroes, ethnic icons more rapidly than boxing. No sport will identify huge economic success at a higher level than boxing. Even Grand Prix racers don't make more money than the top boxers in the world. It requires unbelievable self-discipline. It is the hardest sport to train for. It is the hardest sport in which to participate. And when you consider that there are human beings like Oscar De La Hoya and Lennox Lewis who can have $100 or $150 million in the bank and can still go into the gym to do the hardest work in sports at a level so high that only a few people can touch it, that's astonishing to me. I don't know people like that in any other walk of life, really, who are capable of doing what they're doing. So from the standpoint of psychological confrontation, from the standpoint of what it has done to lift people up from the bottom to the top, from the standpoint of what boxers have meant to society and to the historical evolution of societies, there's no other sport like it.